They called it the end of everything the week the ticker stopped smiling. I remember the sound of the radio in our parlor that evening, the static that felt like cold, a thin wire humming between two worlds, and how my hands would not stop trembling even when Henry laughed like he always did, trying to make it a joke. He tucked more of his hair behind his ear than usual, a nervous habit I had loved since the day we married. "They'll patch it," he said. "This is a town. It survives." His voice folded around itself, thin gauze trying to hold a wound closed. I wanted to believe him, but I didn't. Not when I had seen the men from the factory come home without work slips in their coat pockets. Not when Mrs. Whitaker's son had stood on our doorstep with his hat in his hands and no money for milk. My name is Evelyn Carter. I grew up on the outskirts of Akron, where the Ohio winter sits on your shoulders, like a live thing. But on that October night of 1929, I was 28 and living in a cramped frame house 2 streets over from the brick factory, where Henry had worked as a foreman for 7 years. We had a radio because Henry had been promoted the year before. We'd save for new shoes and sugar, and once with some courage, a piano for me. My father said a woman with music in her hands could always find a place. I taught piano for a few neighbors' daughters and played on Sundays at the Methodist church. Music, I told myself, was a horizon I could reach even if the world narrowed. The first microhook crawled along like a bruise. A crowd at the bank by noon the next day. I remember the sun like something obscene, bright and indignant, while Henry stood at my shoulder and gripped my arm, as though he could hold the whole morning down with his ribs. People had been standing in lines for hours. Some had their coats buttoned up to their chins, against more than weather, as if a coat could keep out the idea of loss. The bank windows looked like dark, concerned eyes. Men pushed against men, and women clutched purses so tight their knuckles blanched white. "They're saying withdrawals are limited," a woman whispered. Alden's not letting out more than $50. $50 felt like a betrayal then, a number small enough to be laughable and large enough to ruin a family. Henry wanted to go inside. He wanted to talk like he always had, calm, firm, a man who could present facts and make them behave. But the teller at the window, a thin man with ink under his fingernails, looked at Henry as if he were made of paper. "Accounts are being frozen," he said. "We don't have—" His sentence dissolved into the shuffling and the sighs of neighbors who had suddenly become strangers. I saw Henry's jaw work. He stood very still, and for a second, his face was the face of a man about to be dragged into a river. We left with our small savings in a locked tin beneath the piano bench, the place I always kept the emergency money. $10 from when my mother passed, 20 Henry had tucked away from overtime. We had $52 altogether, a sum that felt like both lifeline and nothing. That night, I sat at the piano and played until my fingers ached, because the music held a map to the life I still wanted to make. But when I lifted my hands from the keys and the house was silent, I could hear the bank's shadow moving across the floor, like a second, grimmer pulse. The factory cut shifts by the end of the week. Henry came home with small paper slips that smelled faintly of oil and dust. A different weight to his shoulders, depending on whether the foreman had been kind or brutal that day. He tried to find work at other mills in town, but by then the word no had a new pitch to it, slow, patient, as if refusal were a skill. Tommy, my brother, 17, and already with his father's hands, broad and clumsy, started spending his nights on the riverbank with other boys. He said he liked the company, the way others laughed with mouths full of cigarette ash, as if tomorrow did not exist. I took on more pupils, offered to teach for half the price when families came to me with their hands out. Some left after a lesson or two. Mothers muttered about rent and boiled down the lessons into errands and soup. The piano that had once been a small, steady sun in our parlor became a ledger of worry. I would place my palm on middle C and count to calm myself, but the counting grew thin. Money stretched and thinned like cloth being mended and remended. The second micro hook came like a letter. A notice slipped under our door, the paper coarse and official. Foreclosure. The word was a stone I could not swallow. It belonged to the bank's smooth hands, and it said in the cleanest type that Alden and Coder intended to repossess the house if payments did not catch up in 30 days. My mouth went dry. Henry read it twice and did not speak for a long time. Tommy came in from the rain that evening, mud on his boots, and a grin that did not reach his eyes, and sat by the stove as if the room were a country he'd left behind, and returned to find changed. "I can go west," he said suddenly, voice too loud. "I've heard the camps pay for hands. Maybe I can find work, harvests, rail cars, whatever." He said it as if moving were mere geography. But I knew the geography. Boys in flannel shirts huddled under bridges, employers who promised work and paid in promises. The long brown line of the country with its aching hunger. I thought of my father, gone 2 years now, and the places he would have gone rather than ask for help. "You won't," Henry said softly. "Your family." There was fierce tenderness in that softness that made my throat ache. Tommy looked at me, pleading. I did not know which to choose, the pull to protect or the freedom he sought. Sleep became a kind of theft. I would wake up with my palms sticky from the dreams of coins and hands that would not let go. I started waking before dawn, dressing in the dim light, and walking the streets to see what the town looked like when the factories were a chorus of breathing chimneys, rather than the metallic hum they had been. The lines at the soup kitchen grew. Faces I recognized from Sundays in church stood in those queues like ghosts deciding whether to be corporeal or not. I volunteered sometimes because doing something was better than sitting with the fear in my chest. Steaming bowls of broth felt like small miracles. The men said thank you like it was a benediction. One evening, late and wind-battered, there was a knock at our back door. I opened it to find Mr. Alden himself, older than I had imagined, his suit too thin for the chill. His eyes were small and tired, and he clutched a thin envelope as if it were proof of his own humanity. "Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice was small. "I'm sorry to trouble you at this hour." He stepped in uninvited, and Henry, who never drank, offered him coffee without asking. There was a kind of etiquette in these late-night intrusions. It was as if poison could be made tolerable if administered with manners. "I don't want to see you lose your home," Mr. Alden said. "I want to help." He slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a paper, a ledger entry, a mark that indicated a temporary forbearance if certain conditions were met, if payments could be arranged. The bank's mercy came dressed in more paperwork. "There are other families," he said. "We can't keep everyone, but we can find a way." He hesitated. If you can secure work that will allow you to make partial payments, we can defer the process." Henry's hands trembled and then steadied into something like resolve. He promised he would find work in another town if he had to, that he would take any job, that they would sell the piano if need be. My heart folded in on itself at his words. The piano, my fingers recoiled from the thought. Sell the instrument of my voice, admit that the music could not keep our world standing. That night, while Henry slept, I crept to the piano and placed my hands on the keys. The wood was warm from our bodies. The notes rose like ghosts and smelled faintly of coal smoke. I closed my eyes and played until the chords blurred and the sound became a bridge, a prayer I could not otherwise frame. When I stopped, A scrap of paper had slid down the leg of the piano bench. A bill for the mortgage, written in my father's hand years ago. His handwriting was a map I could still read. He had circled a number and written, "Keep faith." I laughed then, a sound without mirth, because faith felt like a mantle I could not afford. We tried to keep up appearances for the neighbors. At the weekly dance the community held in the church basement, Henry and I moved across the floor with practice steps. Laughter was a public currency. To spend it was to declare nothing was wrong. But the corners of the room whispered with other people's secrets. Men who had been steady fathers looked at the dance band with a hunger that was almost animal. Women wrapped their arms tighter around shawls that were more for show than warmth. I danced like a woman with a ledger in her head, counting beats and bills the way other people counted steps. The third microhook came like a rumor. A freight train burning down the line had been stopped by hobos turned militant, men tired of being passed over. Rumors traveled like sparks. In the days after, there were more travelers in town than before, men with knapsacks and hollow cheeks, eyes like coins. They slept under bridges and at the depot. Tommy started going to the depot more often. He said he wanted to talk to the men, to learn how they got work. The men told stories with the smell of their cigarettes, stories of fields and harvests, and the thin bread of other towns. Tommy came home one night with a whistle he had stolen from one of them, and he blew it until the sound filled the house like a summons. "We could ride," he said. "We could go where the work is. Why stay to starve here?" His face had the stubbornness of youth, the thing that believes movement equals hope. I started writing letters, not to anyone in particular. My words became small, private protests that I folded and slid into the piano bench where we hid money. I wrote to the bank in polite, measured sentences begging for patience. I wrote to myself, scolding for not knowing how to trade in the world. I wrote to Henry in the quiet of the night, reminding him of the first time we danced and how he promised me the moon. His replies were short, full of things that sounded like hope, but were really the bones of a plan. "I will go to Cleveland. There is work in the mills there. If I can get steady work for 3 months." The sentences stopped at ellipses like breaths held too long. People say you learn who you are in crisis. I think crisis tests the seams you didn't know you had. It asks if you will rip or mend. I found myself mending in ways that surprised me. I learned to stitch Henry's shirts when the seam frayed, to trade a few piano lessons for bread and a measure of flour, to barter my time at the church in exchange for coal. I learned the small economy of favors. Watch Mrs. Whitaker's boy when she went to town, and she'd give me a dozen eggs, mend that dress, and she'd set aside a jar of preserves. The community became a ledger of kindnesses and debts, not always balanced, but leaning toward survival. But survival has a price. One night, in the middle of a dream about my father returning to sit at the head of our table, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. Henry was in the kitchen, wrestling with the back door. "They're taking the house," he said before I could ask. I wrapped my robe around me and went outside. A truck with the bank's placard sat under the street lamp, 2 men moving swiftly, cataloging our chairs and our dishes as if they were preparing a museum exhibit of our life. Tom's whistle lay on the stoop, where he had dropped it earlier, dull and useless. My fingers clutched the railing so hard they hurt. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at the men who handled our life like an inventory. Instead, I walked back in and sat at the piano. I played until my shoulders stopped shaking. The notes went out into the night and returned to me like a mirror. Henry packed a small bag with the things he thought we could not live without. Our photo albums, the Bible, the tin with our savings. "We'll find a place to stay," he said. He asked the bankmen for time, for understanding. "There are children," he said. They did not look at him the way neighbors do when they see you with your hands open. They looked at him as if he were one of the ledger columns they respected for its simplicity. I set the ledger my father had left on the piano and began to write a new line, a promise to survive, to keep our music if we could. The house would be gone in a week if nothing changed. The piano hummed under my hands like a barometer. I lay my head on its lid and listened to the murmurs of the wood, the way it remembered our laughter. Outside, the town slept unaware of the small calamity that had settled on our street like a fog. Inside, I could feel the world shifting, a tectonic move that would change the map of our lives. I did not know then how far we would be forced to go to keep our sense of home. I did not know which promises would be kept and which would break like thin ice beneath the weight of a man. But I knew this: when the house left us, I would take the music with me. I would carry it like a child on my hip, warm and beating against my chest. And there, with the piano under my hands and the truck's lights painting the wallpaper gold, I found the courage to open the ledger again and to write a single line I had not allowed myself before. We will not be erased. I didn't sleep the night the bankmen came. Even after they drove away, even after the street fell still and the wind died down, my eyes refused the simple mercy of closing. Henry lay beside me with one arm slung across his chest, breathing in those small, uneven pulls he made only when afraid. I listened to them like they were a metronome of our unraveling. Every inhale seemed to ask a question. Every exhale seemed to give up on an answer. By dawn, the sky had turned that pale, ghostly yellow Ohio wears before winter decides to announce itself. I slipped from the bed without waking Henry, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and lit a single lamp. The house always looked different in the early hours. Meaner, maybe. Honest in a way daylight softened. The walls we once painted sunshine gold now carried the dull of needing a fresh coat we couldn't afford. The kitchen table had a wobble Henry promised to fix a year ago, and the piano, my one luxury, stood there with its wood glowing softly under the lamp, like it knew something was coming. It didn't want to say aloud. I sat down and pressed my palm to the keys. They were cold. The first micro hook of the morning came with a knock. Not the bank, not neighbors. Something in the rhythm of it, careful, hesitant, made my pulse start flickering. When I opened the door, Tommy stood there with his coat only half buttoned, eyes red-rimmed but wide awake. "You need to come see something," he said. At first, I feared he meant the house. Maybe the bank had returned early. Maybe some men had gathered to watch like it was sport. But when I stepped outside, I saw he was looking down the street. A stretch of houses that looked just like ours, wood-framed and weathered by years of small joys and small failures. At the end of the road, where the Hartfords lived, a crowd had gathered. "Evelyn," Tommy swallowed. "It's Mrs. Hartford." My feet felt heavy as we walked closer. I prayed silently for something small, an accident, a fainting spell, something solvable, something that didn't have to be tragic. But when we reached the crowd, I saw the truth immediately. The Hartford's front door hung open, the windows dark, and two men from town, men who volunteered with the sheriff when needed, carried out a stretcher covered with a blanket too thin to hide the shape beneath it. Mrs. Hartford had taken her own life. The shock moved through the crowd like a cold wind. People murmured about debts, about her husband losing work at the mill, about how thin the children had looked last week. Someone whispered that she'd left a note, something about being a burden. I stood there frozen, my hand clutching Tommy's sleeve. She had been my age. She had stood next to me at church potlucks and commented on my hymns. She laughed loudly. She baked gingerbread the first week of every December. She was not the kind of woman who broke, which meant none of us were safe from breaking. Tommy leaned, close. "Ev, we can't wait for the bank to finish us off. We need to do something." There it was, the second micro hook, a shift, a demand. But what could we do? Henry had mentioned Cleveland, Mills, maybe work, maybe salvation, but Cleveland was 50 miles away, and we barely had enough to travel, let alone live. Yet something inside me whispered that staying was the real danger. This town was shrinking. Not in size, its streets and houses remained, but in spirit. People walked differently, talked differently, looked at each other with apology instead of warmth. I felt it then like a spark. If we stayed, we'd drown with everyone else. That afternoon, when Henry woke, when the news of Mrs. Hartford traveled to our doorstep, when the weight of it settled over our small kitchen like a shroud, I finally said aloud what had been gathering in my chest since autumn began. "We have to leave." Henry stared at me. "Ev, I'm serious." My voice trembled, but I kept it steady. "We can't keep this house. We can't stay in this town waiting for the next letter, the next man with a clipboard, the next neighbor, who—" My voice cracked. "We have to go where there's a chance, a small one even, but a chance." Henry rubbed his face hard, as if trying to wake himself from the thought of it. "Where? Where would we even go, Evelyn?" "Cleveland," I said. "You said the Mills were hiring, and if not there, then maybe farther north, Detroit. Factories still need hands, and I can teach, I can play, I can make something anywhere, so long as we're not here waiting to sink." He looked toward the piano then, a look I recognized immediately. Fear mingled with guilt. "You're willing to sell it," he whispered, barely a voice. No, I wasn't. Not truly. But survival demands a ledger of sacrifice. "If it gets us a roof," I said softly, "I am." The lie stung like a burn. But Henry reached for my hand, and in that moment I understood something deeper. He loved me fiercely enough that losing the piano wounded him more than it did me. That night, we sat at the kitchen table with every scrap of money and every item worth selling laid out between us. Henry's tools, my sheet music, the good silver from my mother, 2 quilts stitched in better years, the wedding china we rarely used. The total wouldn't carry us far, but it would get us out of Akron. The plan formed slowly. 3 days, sell what we could, pack only what we could carry. Let the bank take the house, leave before they could come back with a truck. It felt like betrayal. It felt like escape. The next morning, I walked to the church to tell Pastor Reed we were leaving. He was a tall man with kind eyes and hands that trembled too often, as if he carried more grief than he could hold. "We'll miss you, Evelyn," he said, placing his hand on mine. "But you're right to go. The Lord sometimes asks us to walk into the unknown. It's the walking that matters." He looked as if he wanted to say more, but then his gaze flicked to the hallway where the soup line had already begun forming, men and women waiting with quiet desperation. I understood. Everyone needed him. We all needed something. As I turned to leave, a young girl, maybe 10, tugged my sleeve. "Will you still play music?" she asked. Something in her question broke me. Music felt suddenly like my only intact piece of self. "Yes," I said, kneeling so we were eye level. "Wherever I go. I promise." The third micro hook arrived that evening when I returned home to find Tommy missing. His whistle lay on the kitchen table. Next to it, a note in his messy handwriting. "Ev, don't worry, I'm going ahead. There's work somewhere. I'll send for you and Henry when I find it. Don't come after me." Tom. My heart lurched. The boy was 17. Too young to chase freight trains. Too young to disappear into the underside of America, where men slept on burlap and gambled their names away for a loaf of bread. Henry folded the note slowly. "He'll get himself killed." "We have to find him," I said immediately. "We can't," Henry replied. "Not yet," He could be anywhere. We'll go when we can, but right now we don't even know which direction he took. But I knew. The depot. That was where he'd been listening to stories. That was where the drifters gathered. And within an hour, we were walking toward the depot with only lantern light to guide us. What we found there, under the skeletal frame of the station, made my breath turn to ice. A group of men huddled near the tracks, 8 or 9, ragged coats, boots with holes, hair unshaven. They watched us approach with wary eyes, the kind that had forgotten how to trust. One stood up, broad-shouldered, face gaunt but sharp. He stepped forward. "You looking for someone?" he asked. "Yes," I answered before Henry could. "A boy, 17, red flannel shirt. You might have seen him. He talks too fast and whistles too much." The man studied me, then shifted his gaze to Henry. "He left on the morning freight," he said, "headed west. Didn't say much except he was going to make something of himself." My stomach fell. "Was he alone?" Henry asked. The man shook his head. "No, a few others hopped with him. Some older boys. Not all good ones." A cold ripple passed through my spine. "Did they hurt him?" Henry's voice had a dangerous edge. "No," the man said. "But the rails are cruel. You don't need a knife to bleed." I stepped closer. "Please, do you know where the next stop is? Or where they'll be by morning?" He hesitated, then pointed westward. "Columbus Run," he said. "If he stays on, maybe Indianapolis next. Maybe farther. Hard to say." The men looked at me then with a strange tenderness, as if seeing their own mothers or sisters or wives in my fear. One of them pulled something from his coat, a small, dented railroad badge. "Give him this if you find him," he said. "Means he's got friends out here." I stared at it in my palm, the cold metal biting into my skin. When we turned to go home, the night felt bigger than it ever had. The tracks gleamed like silver veins stretching into a country too vast to hold. Back at the house, Henry sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "He's a fool," he whispered. "Just a boy." "He's scared," I said. "We all are." And then, for the first time since the crash, Henry broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in one soft exhale that sounded like surrender. I knelt beside him and took his hands. "We're going to find him," I said. "No matter how far he's gone. But first, we have to survive long enough to reach him." The next morning brought another blow. A final notice pinned to our door. The house would be seized in 4 days. The fourth microhook twisted itself sharply into my chest. 4 days. 4 days to sell everything, to pack, to leave, to find Tommy, to save ourselves before the town swallowed the last of us. We didn't speak much that day. Silence was quicker, easier. Conversations had become too heavy to carry. Neighbors drifted in and out, offering condolences disguised as curiosity. Mrs. Whitaker brought bread she couldn't afford to give and cried when I thanked her. By evening, the house looked like a ghost of itself. Shelves bare, walls naked, the table missing its chairs. I had sold the quilts, the china, my good shoes. And finally, it came time for the piano. I stood before it with my hand resting on its lid. The wood seemed to breathe. The keys waited. I sat down and played what I thought would be my farewell. But something happened. Something I did not expect. A small crowd gathered outside our open window. Neighbors, children, strangers walking past. They stopped and listened. Some cried, some whispered prayers. Some simply stood with their hats in their hands, as if honoring a passing. The fifth microhook came when the music ended, a knock on the door. A wealthy man I had never seen before, a traveler passing through, stood there with his coat still dusted with snow. "I heard you," he said, "and I want that piano." My chest tightened. It's not for sale, I whispered. Everything's for sale in times like these, he replied gently. Name your price. I shook my head. I didn't trust my voice. But Henry stepped forward, jaw tight, eyes full of pain. We need the money, he said. We have to go west. Our son. Brother, I corrected quietly. Our boy, Henry continued, is out there somewhere, and we have to find him. The man looked at me, then at the piano, then back at me. I won't haggle, he said. I'll pay what it's worth before the crash, not after. A number written on a slip of paper. A number that could save us. A number that could take us out of Akron, across Ohio, through the cities, onto the rails, into whatever future waited. My hand trembled as I touched the piano one last time. The wood was warm, almost alive. I pressed one final key, middle C, a single, steady note. Goodbye. I'll sell it, I said. My voice broke, but the ledger of survival required signatures made in grief, and the house echoed with silence as the men lifted the piano and carried it away. The absence of its weight changed the air. I felt gutted, but I also felt something else. A door opening where another had closed. That night, with our suitcases packed and our money hidden beneath Henry's coat, we sat in the darkened house one last time. Tomorrow, we would leave. Tomorrow, we would chase Tommy. Tomorrow, our real journey would begin. And as the cold wind seeped through the thin walls, I whispered a promise into the darkness. We will not break. We will not disappear. But the world was already shifting again, and danger was waiting on the horizon.